Hi everybody, this is Tristan, and I just read Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies, Migrant Farm Workers in the United States by Seth M. Holmes, PhD, MD. And in this book review, I'm going to be giving a little summary of what he talked about in each chapter, in addition to my own thoughts at the end. In the introduction, Seth M. Holmes goes straight into a story of how he joined a group of Triqui migrants starting in San Miguel on the Oaxaca Mountains in Mexico and trying to attempt a border crossing. Each of them brought between $1,000 and $2,000 in order to pay for the trip, and the trip was very, very dangerous, having to sneak by different border patrols, having to run through a desert where you could run out of water and die, getting bitten by all sorts of wild animals. And so he starts the discussion of, is it worth it for these people to try to cross when it's so dangerous? And the answer is that they have to. The economic realities back where they live in San Miguel are such that they can either die slowly back home, or they can take this extremely risky action and try to make money in the United States. So ultimately, it's not a choice. It's really something that they have to do if they are to survive. That pushes them across. In this chapter, Holmes talks a lot about his research methods and how he's going out and collecting data, which is essentially living and working among these Triqui migrants on farms in the Puget Sound, in addition to some farms in California, which he talks a little bit about later. In addition to simply recording their responses and seeing how they suffer, he goes out and he suffers alongside them using his own body as a device for research. His body and the body of his companions come up as well, because his body as a white body is treated much different than his Triqui companions when they go out in public, when they go to medical practices, etc. So this experience to him not only gave him a lot of data, but it also fed his desire for social change. He ends by talking about how our world is very reliant on migrant workers, and he uncovers in this book that there's a lot of violence toward them, both structurally and normal violence, and they shouldn't be treated that way if they are so important. In this chapter, Holmes talks about the ethnic hierarchies in place at the Tanaka brothers' farm in the Skagit Valley that he stayed and worked at for about half a year. He talked about how there's many different levels in the hierarchy of work that happen to correspond very well with race. So starting with like the farm executives and the crop managers, which are all white and Asian, moving down to the supervisors, administrative assistants, which are generally US Latinos in addition to being white, moving down to the checkers, which are generally white teenagers, and moving down to the hourly field workers, which are usually mestizo Mexicans and Mixtec Oaxacans, to the lowest of the low, which are the contract workers, which are Triqui men and women. The farther you move down the hierarchy, the more that the responsibilities, the stressors, and the privileges differ. Holmes goes into all of the struggles that the Triqui workers face, having to work basically the entire day with no breaks in order to make quotas, in order to make any money at all and not be fired, and how there's little pay even then. He talks a lot about how in this hierarchy, each level does have its own difficulty, but inherently there are these different responsibilities, stressors, and privileges at each level. At the end of the chapter, he concludes that on the Tanaka farm, class, race, and citizenship conspire to deny Triqui workers respect and deprive them of physical and mental health. The structural violence is really, really hard on these Triqui workers that are at the bottom of the hierarchy. In this chapter, Holmes talks about the violence continuum, and he does this using three main vignettes from his research. On page 90, he says, while the suffering of Triqui berry pickers in general is determined by their position at the bottom of various hierarchies, each of these three vignettes serves to underscore the embodiment of a different expression of the violence continuum. So the first vignette is about Abelino, who has physical suffering because of the physical circumstances working. He has intense knee pain to the point of sometimes needing to stop working, and has to get injections just so he can continue working. While you can say that the root of this is the fact that he is picking, the ultimate root comes from his social and economic situation, which drove him into that job as a picker, where there's no breaks, intense physical labor, and very little pay. The second vignette is about Crescentio, who has debilitating headaches that are so excruciating that he also has to stop work. And the root of this is insults and racist comments. Every time that he was mistreated by supervisors and called names, he would develop these extremely excruciating headaches. This is, again, because of his structural vulnerability. There's a link between his suffering and the symbolic forces in his life. Lastly, Bernardo suffers intense stomach pains to the point of not wanting to eat, and so he asks to have shots in order to increase his appetite, just so he has the energy to keep working. He attributes this to the fact that in Oaxaca he was suspected of being linked to a liberation movement, and so soldiers were sent to his house and he was beaten until he spat blood. And that was when the stomach pain started, and the reason that they continue is because he continues working, because he cannot afford to stop working in order to help himself medically. So in all of these cases, you can take a look at the immediate circumstance that developed these things. You can think of the picking for the knee, the insults for the headache, and you can think of the beating for the stomach pains. But ultimately, there's a structural reason behind each of these, socially and economically, that is the root of these causes. In this chapter, Holmes elaborates on each of the three vignettes that he talked about. In an earlier chapter, specifically delving into how each of them received health care, whether or not it was effective, etc. So he starts off with Abellino's knee, again, talking about how he went to several different doctors where there was never a sufficient translator, and how he was always told that he should not work but let his knee rest. The problem is that he cannot do that. He needed to continue working in order to support himself and his family. So he did try to take out workers' compensation claim. However, given that most of the documents were written in English, he was never able to respond to different letters and have anything actually happen. Finally, Holmes, the writer of this book, stepped in to try to help the claim and be a translator. But even then, Abellino was supposed to be on light work, which didn't exist on the farm, so he went back to the same work as before, and ultimately no action was really taken. In addition, the small compensation that he was able to receive would be taken away as soon as he left the farm for the season, which he needed to do in order to work in California to continue making money anyway. So when he returned the following year, again, he wasn't able to receive compensation. He concluded that doctors don't know anything. These same miscommunications happened with Bernardo and with Crescentio. On page 143, Holmes says, like many of the U.S. clinicians, this physician was not able to see Bernardo's social and occupational context, and instead blamed his suffering on his assumed behaviors and culture. So in addition to the various boundaries in terms of the worker not being able to stop work in order to become healed and language barrier, there's also a particular lens that these clinicians view these tricky people. However, Holmes does not blame these clinicians. He says that thus it is unavoidable that they would fall into a trap of using their lens that functions to decontextualize sickness, transporting it from the realm of politics, power, and inequality to the realm of the individual body. In their training, they're supposed to look at purely biomedical reasons, and then they bring their biases into these situations. So Holmes calls us to look at structural competency. He says that the structure of healthcare must be changed to offer quality care to all patients instead of seeking private profit and cost savings. The contemporary biobehavioral clinical gaze must be transformed to recognize the social, political, and economic determinants of sickness and health to include structural competency. Just like we've talked about in PPHS, this structural competency is very, very important to giving these patients the care that they deserve, the care that they need, and the care that's specific to their situation. Because if doctors treat them just on their symptoms without taking a look at their social and economic situations, they're not going to be healed. In this chapter, Holmes talks about how we naturalize and internalize the suffering of these migrant workers. The first big contributor that he talks about is how hidden these migrant bodies are from the public. They're out of the public's eye, they're out in the country, they're rural areas, and such that not many people are made aware of them. And it's crazy to think that even where I live right now, within 10 miles, there could be thousands and thousands of migrant workers that I am unaware of because of the way that the process is distanced from my purchases as a consumer. They're hidden from the public eye. In addition, people have preconceived ideas about the people that work in these migrant farms. Quote on page 163, much like sand is considered clean when it's on a beach or in a sandbox, but dirty when it is inside a house or on a child's hands, those considered Mexican and therefore out of the proper place are often referred to as dirty. People have a lot of preconceived ideas about immigrants and what they're coming here to do, whether it be stealing jobs or doing this dirty work, and that makes it easier for us to accept their position. In addition, they're blamed for their suffering. On page 163, Holmes quotes a California resident that he is interviewing, who said, "You can do anything you want to in this country. Anyone can be anything they want. There's no excuse in this country. There are no barriers. Nothing holds you back except you. You have no one to blame if you don't become the best you could except for you." We say that these workers, the reason that they're in such a low paying job with such terrible working conditions is that they simply don't put in enough work to make it out. But the reality is that they're stuck in this position and they're trying as hard as they can to get out of it. But we continue to blame them for those reasons. In addition, we normalize their positions by just getting used to seeing their conditions, or by assuming that it's normal for them to be in these conditions. Oh, they've done this for generations, they're used to it, they always do this. In addition, there's segregation in the way that the work camps are organized, in the way that they're hidden out of the way of the farm, and that segregation also aids this normalization. Overall, this causes us to internalize this hierarchy and makes us think, oh, it's all as it should be. What we really do need to do to bring about change, what Holmes says on page 181, in order for there to be an effective, broad coalition of people working to change the unhealthy inequalities in U.S. agriculture, we must first see such hierarchies as socially and historically constructed as malleable. We need to understand that we're the ones that created these hierarchies, and as such, we have the capacity to change them. In this last chapter, Holmes talks about the hope that there is for change amidst all this structural violence. He talks about how ultimately our perspectives need to shift so that we can understand this potential for transformation. On page 185, he writes, "If we social scientists are to research, theorize, and confront socially structured suffering, we must join with others in a broad effort to denaturalize social inequalities, uncovering linkages between symbolic violence and suffering. In this way, the lenses of perception, as well as the social inequalities they're reinforced, can be recognized, challenged, and transformed." We need to understand that there's a link between the suffering and the structural violence, and by reading books like this and staying in the know, the general public can make choices that cause the rearranging of these hierarchies, challenge them and transform them for the better. Moving on, Holmes quotes Paul Farmer's idea of pragmatic solidarity and gives some ideas that farms can use in order to practice this on the farm. So an example would be like offering English classes, giving pesticide education, having more fair means of hiring and advancement on the farm, and even just small things like improving living conditions, like paving certain areas that are usually full of mud. Lastly, he moves on to medicine, public health, and liberation medicine, and he talks about how we really need to stop medicalization. And on page 193, he says that medicalization is the defining of an entity as primarily or solely medical while stripping it of its political, social, historical, and economic context. We need to stop looking at these people just for their biology and instead look at their complex social, economic, and political contexts. He then goes on that same page to say, How would the role of health professionals be defined if we took seriously our call to relieve and prevent suffering while also remembering the structural forces fundamentally producing this suffering? So we need to take a look beyond, above and beyond just treating the illness and move into social contexts and economic contexts and political contexts and make changes that prevent the suffering in those ways as well. Overall, and in the end, he calls us to work towards bettering the lives of the people who provide us with fresh fruit in exchange for their broken bodies. I learned a lot from this book. It really opened my eyes to the whole world of migration, what these people suffer, why they suffer, how it's not often their own choice, but it's their social, economic, and political contexts that drive them to the suffering in order to simply survive. It also taught me a lot about the failings of medicine, how this medicalization causes people to receive really inadequate care. They go into the clinic and they're treated for their symptoms, but then they go right back into the structural factors that cause the suffering in the first place. And so we need to understand that we need to go beyond just care in the clinic in order to keep them healthy and give them really the care that they need. I also love that there's a lot of hope moving forward, that books like these raise awareness about these many issues, and that there's a wonderful movement in the medical world towards structural competency that we've already been learning about in PPHS and in sociology classes. I learned a lot from this book that I can apply to my own life as well. Like in my volunteering experience and in my shadowing experiences, I can take a look at people's entire contexts rather than just their current issues in trying to help them and treat them, and seeing how the doctors that I'm shadowing are doing that as well. Overall, I need to learn more about structural competency and factor and other subjects like this so that I can become the best doctor that I can be. I need to do more than just doing well in my science classes in order to move forward. I need to understand the political, economic, and social situation of the world and of the people around me. So thanks to Seth Holmes for this book.